Hi there, Shane and Caitlin here, and welcome to Science on the Table.
The podcast that covers all things South African science, where we take the tough stuff and break it down into bite-sized bits so you don't have to.
That's right, from soup to nuts. So let's lay it all out on the table.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated institutions or organizations. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, the content shared is for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice. Some information may become outdated as new research emerges. Always consult primary sources or professionals for advice related to your field of interest. The hosts are not liable for any errors or omissions in the content, and listeners should critically evaluate the information presented.
Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Science on the Table. Today we've got a different kind of scientist on the episode, and he's going to give us a rundown on recently published papers of his that revolve around endurance sporting events, and he's going to give us the background on the science, and his specialization is atmospheric science, but I'm going to give it over to him to introduce himself. Henno, welcome. Thank you for your time. Thank you for agreeing to come onto the podcast and sharing your insights and your professional experience. If you could maybe just introduce yourself, what your qualifications are, where you work, what type of work you do, what type of research you do, and what got you interested in the topic that we are going to cover today.
Hi, Shane. Hi, Caitlin. Thanks. When you said rundown, I was wondering if it was pun intended. So, in the context of the podcast.
Puns are always intended, Henno.
So, in the risk of going on about my whole life, I'll just try and give a brief summary. I am currently at the Northwest University. I've actually always been at the Northwest University. I studied there. I started with a BSc in geography and zoology, moved on doing honors in environmental sciences, MSc environmental sciences, and from that point on, I started specializing in atmospheric sciences and actually numerical weather modeling and cloud microphysics, which is a whole podcast on its own. Did that for my PhD as well. And I really just fell in love with all things atmospheric science related, weather prediction, climate modeling, the measurement of the environment around us, particularly the atmospheric environment. And over time, I just continued with what I'm doing. I realized I really love academia. Very lucky to have found a permanent position at the Northwest University as an atmospheric scientist teaching applied climatology, agricultural climatology. I have a bunch of students that have a couple of interesting projects that I'm supervising. And along the way, as a side project, I also combined my love of running and atmospheric sciences. And it led to this little side project that actually became something interesting and bigger than I thought it would be.
So if anyone has had a little bit of experience in the Comrades Marathon before, they'll know when the entries opened a few weeks ago, it was quite a scramble to get one. Everything was sold out within 10 hours, I think, which is up to this point, I think, a record for the number or the time frame for selling out all those entries. If anyone is stressed, there are still going to be entries available, I'm sure. So ask your friends who are not prepared. But you can ask any South African, and they kind of have an idea, or they've at least heard of the Comrades Marathon. So Henno, can you start us off with what makes the Comrades Marathon such an iconic ultramarathon? And why did you specifically choose this for your heat stress research?
That's a loaded question. I think it's also somewhat of a personal question, which I'll try and delve into. So from a South African perspective, at least my perspective as a South African, I mean, it's just a race that's so mystical in a way. I mean, the distance, the area that it's in, it's just one of the most beautiful places in the country. And then also, I guess the underlying philosophy that formed the Comrades these people that came together after World War One to celebrate this camaraderie. I think it's just something that's really special and that's stuck. It's surprising that people way back then ran this distance with, I guess, the shoes that they had back then. But yeah, and over the years, it just grew. I think South Africa's history also led, the history of isolation, also led to us really focusing internally on the sporting events that we had, which allowed events such as Comrades to just continuously grow. People couldn't necessarily compete in other places. And here was this event that acted as an outlet that all South Africans could compete in. I think if you follow the history of the Comrades, I think it's one of the first events where really all races competed together and against each other, first sporting events at least. From a personal perspective, I grew up in a running family, which is funny because I never really liked running, but I grew up in a running family and I grew up going to the Comrades. My dad did 13 Comrades marathons and my mom did 5. And we would literally go and they would run the Comrades and somehow they would leave us as little children to go with other people and to help second. And so I grew up next to that route, seeing the camaraderie, seeing the race, and it just really stuck with me. And then as I grew older, when they slowly started running less and less, they just went down for fun, that's like, they're still going down every year. It's kind of a weekend away in Durban at the Comrades. And how I actually got into this research, with all that said, over the course of my high school career, I did start falling in love with running, but more short distances. And then as I finished my PhD, this was in 2020, more or less, COVID happened, and then the Comrades was cancelled. 2020, 2021, it was cancelled. And then when they said it's happening again, this was, I guess, late 2021, I can't remember exactly. They announced that the date would be late in August. And because it was COVID, I was at home a lot in Rustenburg with my parents and with their running club. And the people around the running club was saying, this is the worst idea ever, And it was interesting for me. I was like, you guys are saying this. Why are you saying this? And then you get the snippets of runners saying, the weather is bad, going to be bad in August, it's going to be warm. They were saying they were complaining about training in the dark throughout winter, training in the cold, that also led to a higher risk of injury for them. So all of these were interesting things that I heard from athletes on the ground. And for me, it was really interesting because I really believe in almost practice-led theory. I think there's so much knowledge out there that we haven't really quantified scientifically. And here I heard on the ground people were saying X, Y, Z. I was like, okay, well, let's actually look at it. And I have the skills to analyze this complex climatological data set. I also understand running. I understand the race. And yeah, that's more or less how the race or the research came about around the race. So everything throughout my life kind of pulled up to me having an interest in the Comrades and interest in this research.
Thanks for that introduction and background sketching. First questions first. Are there any plans on ever entering a Comrades?
Shane, this is a tricky one. I would like to do the Comrades. I'd like to do it because it's such an iconic event, but I have no desire to run more than 1 or 2 Comrades. Listeners can, of course, go look on Strava, but if you go far enough back, you'd see that I was a very competitive runner way back. And the fun part of running for me is being at a starting line and being competitive. And I don't think I'd enjoy running the Comrades if I'm just running, at the back. Maybe in 10 years, that attitude will change, but I definitely like to do it. I'd like to be competitive. But life and everything else has made me not competitive anymore. So I'm just enjoying jogging and training and avoiding racing at all costs.
Yeah, and it's understandable. And I know also, especially if you're competitive, you're more likely to suffer from injury. And when you get older and you have a professional life outside of running, it's also difficult to juggle those things. So I think it takes some doing, to actually be at compete at such a high level, or at least function at such a high level in your sport, considering you still function at that level in your professional life as well.
Yeah, I'm very lucky, Shane. So, those people that know Potchefstroom would know that it is a heaven for athletics and track and field.
Mhm.
And the Northwest University, which I'm affiliated with, as one of the best high performance institutes in the world. We also have one of the nicest grass tracks. The weather's perfect, the altitude's perfect. And if you go there, if you go to Porch today, which is end of November, for the next 3 months, you will see Olympians that people pay good money to see training around Potchefstroom. So I shouldn't look for too many excuses because I live in the perfect place. I think what does happen is, you just kind of get over running at a certain stage if you've competed at a certain level. And I get these urges to come back, and hopefully there's an urge that just sticks. Because I live South Africa is an amazing place to run.
It's true what you say, and we're very fortunate with good weather, even here in Gauteng. And as a runner and a scientist, I have to admit, it just, your description just gives me goosebumps, because you don't get that often, when passions meet. And I think very few people are so lucky to work or make a professional life out of something they enjoy. And I know you said that it's kind of like it started as like a side project, and it's developing into something bigger, which is good, because I think South Africa needs that. And then, the science behind it. And when minds are put together, we might end with a very good system, very good results, because ultimately, but our discussion will lead to that. But, I'm sure whatever you study might ultimately affect nutrition and hydration, athlete performance. We're really keen to get all your thoughts on your recent work. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce what we're basically going to speak about today. So I came across your first paper, which was around climatic conditions on the Comrades 2022 event, which was going to take place in August. And I read the paper where you stated that the earliest the event was ever held during the year was late May, and middle of June was the latest it was ever held. So naturally, questions would arise, because now it's 2 months on to the usual date. People are worried about the climatic conditions. What does that mean for runners? Because now the training season's also a little bit longer. You have to train through winter, which people usually use, or South African runners use to hibernate. But we're going to touch on that paper first, and then a commentary, because this paper was published in the South African Journal of Science. And then a commentary was also published on your paper about some index that you used, and then you responded. So we'll walk you and maybe the listeners just systematically through the structure. And then we're going to touch on the most recent paper, which actually was published on the conditions of the actual Comrades Marathon 2022, if I'm correct.
Yes.
Okay. So just for the listeners, for context, the Comrades Ultramarathon, a marathon is 42.2 loosely kilometers. An ultramarathon is anything further than 42 kilometers, anything further than a marathon. The Comrades Marathon is next level. The distance changes slightly every year. It is a 90-kilometer odd running race. You get 12 hours to run this race, and it's basically mostly the same route. 1 year, it's a down run from higher above sea level, starting in Pietermaritzburg, and you run down to Durban. And the alternating year, it's an up run, and then you run from Durban, which is at sea level, back to Pietermaritzburg. Starting with the first paper, I'm going to hand it over to Caitlin so she can maybe start asking questions around the paper, questions that we had when we read your work.
Okay, so we want to start with some of the technicalities around your paper. One of the objective measures that you used in this paper was the Universal Thermal Comfort Index. So we would just like to ask, why did you specifically use that index, and what is that index?
Yeah, so the word objective with these thermal comfort indices, and there's a lot of them. I think if I remember correctly, and it's in that response, it's like close to 200 different indices. It's based on these various models that's developed mainly by physiologists. So the physiologist would go out and would say, okay, what do we think happens in the human body as it's generating heat, as it's exposed to to environmental conditions. So it's not necessarily just heat, but also moderate conditions, cold conditions, extreme cold conditions. And, everyone has a different take on it. Some people might say, okay, let's take X, Y, Z into consideration. Other people might say, no, let's take A, B, C into consideration. And what the UTCI is a natural evolution of these indices over time, as our knowledge of the physiology, of human physiology has improved, also as the indices has naturally adapted to different clothing models, etc. And the UTCI is kind of the latest iteration of this index, trying to really take the latest knowledge and put that in a thermal comfort index. And in the thermal comfort community, and just to be clear, I'm not a thermal comfort index expert. Within the thermal comfort community, the UTCI was then decided as, we need to standardize these indexes. If everyone goes around using 100 different types of indexes, it doesn't really help us to understand problem from a standardized perspective, if that makes sense to the listeners. And that was one of the fundamental reasons why we chose the UTCI. It's based on the newest metabolic models of each generation, clothing models. It represented the active human a little bit better, but there's various limitations, and there's limitations with all of these 172 indexes. But our paper didn't set out to evaluate the indexes. It just said we assume certain truths with the UTCI, and that the UTCI, based on literature, is a very prominent index that's coming to the forefront and that's being encouraged to be used by researchers. The index that preceded the UTCI, that's still being used very commonly, is the wet bulb globe temperature, which is also, a variation of the UTCI.
Okay, perfect. So we understand this index with certain assumptions was then used to assess climatic conditions, because your objective was to determine what are the odds of runners experiencing heat stress, or what would be the heat stress conditions during this time of the year. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so one can't say this is a superior or an inferior measure. We just assume, we take this, as you say, we need a certain standardized measure, and you use this measure and to determine what heat stress conditions might be like. Okay, so but then just to break it down a little bit more, could you define what heat stress is, and then generally how is it determined? I suppose that would be physiologically.
Yeah, determined. So it is complex. I don't want to say that this heat stress index, or even the newest one, the UTCI, is like this set index that once you reach a critical threshold, all humans' bodies fail. It's based on these large data sets that's been conducted in laboratories where they test different people. And on average, these indices say, when we reach a certain threshold, we start to see a decline in the body's ability to perform certain functions. The body's ability to cool itself down, to efficiently transfer blood through the whole system, and then subsequently the body essentially shuts down. It shuts down processes to protect itself. In the extreme case, you get heat stroke and you just pass out as a protection measure.
And I think for the listeners, one thing we like to say as scientists, at least I like to say that because it's also kind of conceding, nothing is an exact science. So we take the best, we do the best with the information we have at the time. And that's something I know that was also a little bit contentious with the COVID vaccines, but oftentimes scientists just don't know because there's no data, and we work on data. And again, we go back to these assumptions. So that's just a little side note. But okay, coming to a runner that is running in whatever conditions, could you maybe genuinely speak to the physiological changes in the human body in different climate conditions? As you've said, maybe blood volume, etc., higher heart rate, and so forth.
Yeah, I have to be careful as atmospheric scientist to delve into the world of sports physiology. But I'm looking at that paper now, and in the second paragraph, we mentioned things. So there was a sports scientist there that was really generous, also from the Northwest University, Prof. Ben Kutsia, that helped me to really understand heat stress a little better. So there's a cardiovascular strain that's caused by the redistribution of the blood to different areas, as part of the body's attempt to keep homeostasis and to protect vital organs. So, maybe from your extremities, your blood just goes towards your vital organs. There's decreased oxygen delivery. There's a reduction in blood flow to your brain, also in inhibiting certain control mechanisms to protect you. And that's when heat stroke starts becoming a real risk. And what we said here is there's a progressive shift in the energy substrate mobilization due to the utilization of more glycogen and less fat. So I guess your body's method of extracting energy changes as well, maybe not in the most efficient source. Fat provides it as a very sustainable energy source. And I like I said, I'm not a physiologist. So I guess glycogen is the opposite of fat, which is not ideal in an ultramarathon event.
The majority of our listeners are not academics and they're not scientists. So I'm going to try and stay away from the technical questions that the three of us might find super stimulating. And I'm going to try and simplify it a little bit. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is just to explain your basic findings on your study. What we've established now is in 2022, the Comrades date has been shifted later by almost 2 months. It had quite a large effect on the heat exertion or the heat experience of some of the athletes. And that's kind of what you've now centered around. So can you just give us a breakdown of what you found with that compared to the previous years where the Comrades was earlier in the beginning of the winter?
Yeah, so it was interesting from the outset for us to try and conceptualize how we want to use the data. At first, we just used an average temperature to represent like the general region and quickly realized, well, this is a point-to-point event over quite a large distance. And for the listeners who've been in the area, it's a valley of 1,000 hills, very eloquently described in Alan Paton's Cry the Beloved Country. And it's complex. It's extremely complicated terrain. And you're going from an inland climate at about, I think Pietermaritzburg is maybe just about 1,000 meters above sea level to Durban at sea level, next to the Indian Ocean, warm and moist. So we realized, okay, we have to actually break this up into sections to really understand what's happening. Also because the race changes. So one year it starts in Pietermaritzburg, the other year it will start in Durban. So we did that. And then also considering that this was just an exploratory study, we used what we call reanalysis data. So reanalysis data is an attempt by global institutions, in this case, the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecast, ECWMF, to combine all the world's observations into this seamless data set that you can extract historical data of weather conditions at hourly intervals for any place on the planet. So it's a model data set. They use input conditions, so they get weather station data from around the globe. Some areas has a lot of weather station data. That's great. The data is kind of self-correcting when you don't have huge empty spaces between weather stations. In other areas, there's less weather stations, and then you use statistical techniques to kind of interpolate what's the potential change in the weather between the stations. Okay, anyway, so a bit of background around the reanalysis data. We use that data, and then this data, essentially, they divided up into grid cells. So you can think of pixels on an image. And in this case, each pixel represents about 0.25 degrees by 0.25 degrees. And in the context of the race, it meant that if you take Durban, Pietermaritzburg, and the halfway mark as 3 grid cells, you essentially get 3 different data points of the route. So it kind of shows you the variation of the climate. But this is from a model data set, considering all that interpolation uncertainty. Anyway, it's a very interesting data set, and it's used in a lot of studies. So we took data from the reanalysis data set, extracted it for those 3 points to represent the changes along the route that you might experience going from a continental climate to a maritime climate. And then we said, okay, let's look at the factors that we think will be an issue. So we said, okay, let's break it down into strong heat stress and very strong heat stress. And if you look at the UTCI index and the description, from this very strong heat stress, on average, that's when you start seeing people that might exhibit symptoms that will adversely impact their health or their performance, in case of a runner, which is a person, already placing their body under strain. So this was interesting for us. So then we said, okay, let's just do some basic descriptive statistics. Just count the number of accumulated heat stress hours, because that's very important. A runner can be instantaneously exposed to a heat stress moment, which can lead to some critical threshold being exceeded. But over the course of a race, there's also that continuous exposure, which was very interesting for us, which needed to be taken into consideration as well. And what we essentially saw is that if you look at the accumulated very strong heat stress and very strong heat stress, you never see very strong heat stress moments in end of May and especially early June. On the contrary, in early June, you barely see strong heat stress moments. It's like very moderate conditions. This was historically. And we said, okay, let's look at the historical data for August. And I guess the analogy that I can use, it's almost like if you want to plan a wedding, you can say, I don't know what the exact weather will be on that day, but I more or less have an idea. In South Africa, in June, on the Highveld, it's going to be clear, blue sky, fine weather. So that's a really nice day, a year ahead of time to plan my wedding. Of course, there's natural variability that exists. That we have to acknowledge that. But on average, if you choose this date, you're fairly safe to choose a good date. And we said, well, of course, we're not saying that August 2023 would be a really bad date. But if you look at the last, how many years did we check? 40 years of data, you're just increasing your risk a little bit. Consider that. Might be that it's the best day ever, nicest Comrades ever. But the risk of that day being unfavorable is much higher than late May, early June. So there's natural climate variability, which you have to take in consideration. And of course, we acknowledge this. We just said, your risk is higher for an unfavorable day. Never in the last 40 years have we ever seen an extreme heat stress moment during the Comrades event for the historical dates that it started. But if you do the same analysis for the past 40 years, in August, we actually see a larger number of strong heat stress days. So the word strong and very strong, that's how the UTCI defines these days, just for the listeners. It's not my definition. So in August, you see strong and very strong heat stress days for the last 40 years at a much higher rate than you see for the May, June dates. The purpose of the paper wasn't necessarily to criticize the date, not at all. I mean, like I said, weather variability has to be taken in consideration, but it creates awareness. So then the organizers can at least say, if it's warmer in August, how can we prep our medical teams? How can we maybe create awareness around this for runners to adjust their pacing strategies, to maybe change their hydration strategy a bit? And that's essentially all we did, is just create awareness that this should be a little bit more in the back of your mind. But the same can be said that we've seen in the last 40 years of the Comrades, we've seen extreme heat stress in the May, June events as well, So that's the climate variability that comes into play. It's just that your chances of that high moment is much higher in August.
Yeah, and just for the listeners, so it's all about probability. And if you, for example, think about something as simple as rain in Gauteng, rainfall, the chances of it raining in Gauteng during June are much lower. They're not zero, but they're much lower than during December, because we have our rainy season during December. And you might pick two random dates during June and December, and then in June it rains in Gauteng, and then in December it doesn't. But it's like you said, it's weather variability. And I think in your paper you also alluded to the fact that this date, what were the reasons behind it? I personally felt that it could have been because the previous 2 years we had these COVID waves, and I think they wanted to escape another COVID wave coming.
Yeah.
That was my feeling. And I think you did allude in your paper that they did not necessarily, it wasn't one of their reasons, the weather patterns or weather conditions wasn't or weren't, part of the reason for deciding on this
Yeah.
date.
Yeah, there wasn't. I mean, if I look at the paper now, and I vaguely remember trying to search in the deep in Google, but I think there was just a news articles which said there was more daylight hours, sorry, not conditions. There was more daylight hours in August, and this improved safety for the runners on the roads. If there's any international listeners, there's potholes on the roads. So in South Africa, it's very prominent and valid reason, but more daylight hours, more heat being captured by the surface of the earth, being radiated
Yes.
back, so it's this complex thing that they didn't really consider the weather. And
and I think it also depends on, literally, I mean, their main objective is to organize this race, so that's what they do. And also, again, for the listeners, it's you as a scientist, it's always good to have data backing any decision. And you as a scientist literally just took data because you did a reanalysis and you just presented the facts. You analyze these data, you presented the facts, and that's open for interpretation. And it's also just a side note, a strong heat stress, very strong heat stress. You looked at the weather conditions, not necessarily the runners, just to make that clear for the listeners as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, sports physiology is so interesting. And I think if I can go back, I definitely consider it as a career path. And I've been very lucky enough, actually, with this paper, and maybe we'll touch on it later, to really delve deep with world-class sports scientists. I mean, that's really brought me into their confides, if I can put it that way. And I've just found it immensely interesting. And I think sports science, I thought a lot about it on more of a philosophical sense, but the value of sports science, it really gives us insight into the human body under very extreme, strenuous conditions. How does the body react? What does it do? What can we do to understand ourselves better? And you can imagine if we go to Mars maybe 100 years from now, 200 years from now, this data will really help us understand, how strenuous interactions with the environment, with things, changes the body, and how can we optimize that. So sports science is very valuable and very interesting.
For sure. And also for the average runner like me, we like to know about those things. We like to know how we can improve our game. Even if it doesn't change the world, it changes my world. I go about my sport a little bit better. Yeah, so great work.
Just a little interesting fact for anyone who cares about little interesting facts. But in the history of the Comrades Marathon, there have only been 2 occasions that it's ever been cancelled. And the first one was for a number of years during World War II that it didn't take place. And the second time it's been cancelled was for 2 consecutive years throughout COVID. Just to give you an idea of how out of the ordinary it was for that date to be changed, and why this paper is so significant, because it was completely out of the ordinary. So only 2 occasions that it has ever been cancelled. Okay, Henno, so practically speaking, can you tell us what's the main takeaway from this paper practically for runners?
So, I mean, I think for runners, in retrospect, there was value in this paper. I think for us now, we can say, this paper was valuable, maybe scientific reasons. The use of the data set was kind of novel. I was the first person, I guess, to ever use UTCI from the reanalysis data set in this way for an ultra event. So I just had the interest. So I was the one that asked that question. But for a runner, if you were a runner before the Comrades and you read this article, you could have probably said, can I be better prepared? Can I do some heat adaptation training, which we 100% know works? So maybe train a little bit more in the heat, go to a sauna, just to get your body more adapt to potential heat stress moments. And then for the race organizers to back then say, okay, let's make sure that we have adequate medical interventions for heat stroke, because it might be that we see marginally more athletes that suffer from these illnesses. And that was, like I said, I think retrospectively there was value. If we look at the paper now, I mean, it's just interesting. It's interesting to see that, because they changed the race back to June anyway. I don't know if it was because of this paper.
We'd like to believe so.
Yeah, I'd like to believe so. No, but I think I mean, there was other things as well. And I think what was a bit complicated is I think there maybe was some public complaints about it. And like you guys said earlier, traditionally you plan your year for that May, June comrades, and then it's difficult to train in the winter, and South Africans love training early. So in the summer at 5 o'clock, it's light. So you can go out, you can do that 60K long run. But now you needed to do your 60K long run. If you're from Gauteng, at 5 o'clock in the morning, it's pitch dark for 2 hours. So that in itself, I'm sure if someone does a little health study, there was probably more running injuries in that year because people had to train in the dark on bad roads or in bad conditions, if I can put it that way. I mean, we didn't explore that. It's just a very out there theory, but it was not ideal for your training leading up to the race.
No, 100%, because I ran comrades that year, and the training during winter was it was hard. I mean, it's something you're used to, but not really used to, because now you have to do very structured training during winter. So it was a tough one to get through, but I mean, we survived to tell the tale. Just one last point on this paper is that I think obviously there are a lot of, but in the greater scheme of things, very few elite athletes. But I think for those people, there's big money on the line looking for those marginal gains. They look at things like weather patterns and how they can best prepare and condition their bodies and their basically engines to perform at their level best on the day. So it's just when you're going prepared, and you just then stand a good chance of winning good money. So I think, and ultimately, once again, last point is that it adds to the data, and one day it's going to inform many more other research studies and runners and so forth. Thanks for that run through on that paper.
I think it's also a valuable methodology. I think the methodology, when people now think about a race, can maybe say, we can do this. There's something that's in science. There's this data set. Let's follow this methodology to quantify let's call it the environmental risk we're looking for. Cape Town can maybe say, let's do a wind analysis, which they maybe should have done a month ago. Anyway, point is, I think the methodology behind the paper might also be valuable in the future.
100%. I actually wanted to comment on the Cape Town one, on this comment of yours. So leading now into the comment on your paper and your response, the comment was about the argument about the UTC index possibly leading to an underestimation of the heat stress for the Comrades Marathon.
Yes.
Because from what I believe, this comment actually touched on the use of this index more for like walking and stuff, not necessarily running and endurance running. But I was actually thinking the same thing, that this index could, something like this or results like this or findings or research like this could actually inform other sporting events, major sporting events. Excuse the pun, but Cape Town is vying for a spot as a part of the world major marathons. And practically people don't always think about these things, but something like Cape Town Marathon, like you've just said, could maybe benefit from studies and research like this. And who knows, it might become a standard practice to do analyses like this. But yeah, comment, if we can maybe touch on this comment on your paper. What was it all about, and do you feel it was a valid and acknowledge that it was a valid comment? How did you respond?
Yeah, it was interesting when I got the email, because it was, if I look at the dates now, I swear it was like 2 years or like a year and a half. Yeah, it was 2 years after the paper was published. So I was like kind of caught off guard. I barely remembered what I did on the paper. Anyway, so initially my reply was like, yeah, we agree, because what was his name? Simpson, sorry, I forgot his first name now. I initially just replied and said, yeah, we agree, like this is not a perfect index. There's probably better indexes, but this index has been used in other studies. It's like a method or a protocol that you might follow if you work in a lab, and based on these studies, we decided we're using this, and that's the underlying truth we accepted in our paper. We acknowledged the limitation. So his comment was very valid and very valuable. So yeah, I wrote the email to the SAGS and I was like, yeah, we agree. Thank you for the commentary. And they're like, no, something a bit more insightful. And that's why I then wrote the commentary. I mean, really don't have any massive reflections other than, I guess in the commentary, we just argued that we agree that the thermal comfort models need refinement. They need to be continuously improved, and they also need to be improved for local populations. And that's maybe where African scientists can come in and say, this UTCI, the PET, WBG, BGT is developed in North America or Europe, where people might be much more sensitive to heat, and some different index could be more valid for Africa. Yeah, there's all these arguments around the index, but for me, I agree. I completely agree.
Okay, great. So fair comment. And as you've said, these indices have limitations, and it's all about what you choose and how you choose to analyze it or implement it. And there are so many variables that play into this that sometimes complicates these things. And all you can do is acknowledge a different perspective.
Yeah, and I'm actually looking at the paper now, and I think, as you said, he actually said we underestimated it, which is great for me. It's like we were conservative. It's a bigger problem than we thought. And this is what research is. It brings the next person to ask a question, and the other person say, oh, interesting, you applied it this way. Maybe we can make it better. Maybe we should consider this. So I never got the idea that it was trying to invalidate my paper. And for me, it was a great extension of the paper. If anything, a paper that starts a conversation, I'm happy about that.
Yes, that's why you do science after all, right? It's trying to do things differently and develop new questions and better ways of doing things.
And I mean, I guess that this will maybe go into the next article. But as I mentioned in my little intro, I started my academic career actually from my honors through my PhD as a modeler and modeling cloud microphysics. And once you understand numerical weather prediction models, climate models, then you understand that there's a lot of uncertainties with these models. There's so much statistics in the background that averages things, that might exaggerate some things, that might be very conservative for other things. That actually the only valid thing you could do is to monitor, to actually get in the field and monitor this data. And this is what that paper built up to.
So I'm going to quickly move on to your most recent paper, which you have now published. This paper studied the climatic conditions along the Comrades Marathon route, and I'm going to just quote you here. This paper provides an overview of the Healthy Environments for Athletes project, which aims to understand the impacts of environmental conditions on athlete health and performance during major sporting events such as long-distance running, cycling, and triathlons, in collaboration with the Strategies to Reduce Adverse Medical Effects for Exercise initiative. The HEAT project carried out a field campaign at the 2022 Comrades Marathon in KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. Can you please give us a little bit of an overview of this study and its findings?
Subsequently, after publishing the first paper, a friend of mine was doing a master's degree that ran with me, Marlies Jordan, a very good 800-meter runner. She was busy with a master's in statistics, and she was kind of looking at the health data for runners for different events under the University of Pretoria's sports science department. And she contacted me and she's like, do you know anything about heat stress? And I was like, you would not believe what I just published, literally within the span of the week. So I sent her the paper and she's like, this is very interesting. And she then subsequently, she put me in touch with the director of the Sports, Exercise Medicine, Lifestyle Institute, Professor Martin Schwalneus, and also at the time, Nicola Suri. She just moved to the Olympic Science Center in Lausanne, so now she's the Olympic scientist. And we immediately got along. So they asked me about the paper and they were like, wow, for the last couple of years, we've been in charge of the medical data that we collect at the Comrades. And this is very interesting what you've published. would you be able to get involved and monitor along the route? And I was like, yes, I would love to do that. And now I'm taking a little step back again. Our research group, the climatology research group at Potchefstroom, our strong point is monitoring. So we specialize in air pollution monitoring, ambient environmental monitoring across South Africa. I mean, we're probably one of the most well-equipped monitoring research groups in the country. So we had all this equipment and we said, yeah, sure, we want to be involved. And so they were kind enough, and I really, Nicola and I are good friends now, and Martin is an amazing guy. They were kind enough to allow me to do this project. And they also provided the funding. That was my first funding as well, to go to the comrades. And we said, okay, what was the problems that we highlighted? Well, we said in the paper that the modeling has some uncertainties. The only real way to know what's going on is to monitor at different places and to monitor at high resolutions. Because previous papers that they wrote as well, and other people around the world wrote, typically look for the nearest weather station. And in some cases, that weather station is 50 kilometers away or 100 kilometers away or somewhere completely irrelevant. It doesn't represent the microclimate conditions. And in a place like KwaZulu-Natal with the complex topography, you need that in situ measurements. So we put together a team. We said, okay, we're going down, and we went all out. Our group leader, Prof. Stuart Pickoff, said, let's take everything we can. So we took our weather stations, which just measure temperature, pressure, relative humidity, rainfall. We also took an aerosol monitor, which measures essentially particulate matter in the atmosphere. And then Prof. Frank Newman also, he's an aerobiologist at the Northwest University. He jumped on board and he brought a spoor trap, which is able to capture biological material, which really impacts people with allergies, so pollen and things like that. So we went all out and deployed these stations along the route and collected the data. And that was the paper. That subsequent paper was just the first glimpse of the field project that we did, which was a first for South Africa and almost the first globally as well.
Great. So what you did is you described the environmental conditions, so that could be used as some sort of a baseline.
It is tricky. I mean, for a baseline, in a strict climatological sense, you need at least 30 years of data to score anything climate related. And really what we set out in the paper is to describe a methodology, to describe like, hey, if you want to understand environmental risk at an event, this is the way to do it. You need measurements at very high resolution intervals. So in our case, we did every 15 kilometers. We did every 15 kilometers because one of our weather stations costs like 100 grand. If you have unlimited money, you could do one every kilometer. I mean, but that's not practically possible, of course. But the goal was out to set out, okay, you cannot rely on a weather station that's far away from your route because it doesn't represent the conditions. So you need this real-time monitoring. And our plan wasn't, well, not real-time monitoring. You need this high-resolution data along the route, right where the athletes are running. And then this weather station also doesn't necessarily comply to the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization standards. So if, let's say, you're the South African Weather Service, you have a weather station, there are certain guidelines that you have to fulfill in where you put that weather station for it to be recognized as a weather station that's accurate. But the reality is we are not in ideal conditions. So you need to put the weather station where the people is, literally on the road, experiencing that radiant heat from the surface, experiencing the incoming shortwave radiation, experiencing the direct conditions you're exposed to. So the reference stations, they're nice, but they're in the perfect conditions. You know, they don't represent that complex urban environments, those really hot roads, those valleys, because they would never put a weather station there. It just doesn't follow standards. Yeah, so that was initially what we described. And then I guess we kind of then moved away from heat because you cannot really control the weather. But then the really novel thing that we found, and luckily Prof. Stewart said take those little PM 2.5 side packs with, was that air pollution along the route was exceptionally bad, like horrendous. And this was really interesting for us. That led to some new data coming out and new insights into the race that we are busy with some publications, and we've been begging for funding everywhere. So air pollution is the next big venture that came out of that field deployment.
That's fascinating because I think it's something, I mean, as a comrades runner, a regular comrades runner, it's something I've never thought about. You always think about what's the weather going to be like? And this year we literally missed very inclement weather by a day because that night after comrades, it started pouring. But that's the extent of my worries. I don't think about the
Yeah.
air pollution because ultimately, what is it going to look like in 10 years time? Is it
Yeah.
still going to be practical, I don't know, would we need other like mitigating measures and stuff like that? So, okay, that's fascinating. And it's good because your study serves as some sort of okay, maybe not a baseline, but just a reference point. And then, future studies could obviously build on that. But there's
Yeah.
data. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, so just for interest sake, that was the first year, 2023, and we've been doing it every year since then with Nicola. So we've been running the project, and I was there this year again with our team of students. We've subsequently downscaled the project because we realized, from a practical perspective, the morning of the race along the route is a bit, it's chillier, so heat stress isn't necessarily an issue. So in the last iteration, we just measured from halfway. In the context of the comrades, from halfway is really when physiologically you're strained, and when anything can impact you, like there might be small triggers, exposure to whatever that really has a major impact on your performance just because your body is in this extremely fatigued state. So you would have
Yes.
seen us there, Shane, if you weren't too tired and you were looking
I was
around.
probably too tired. I'm not going to lie. It's always a matter of fighting for survival. It's a long day. I sometimes even miss my supporters next to the road, so it's a bit of a
Yeah.
tough one. But yeah, it's possible that if one knows, then you might be looking out and try and spot. So I'll do that in the future.
I'm lucky here in Porch. My coach is John Verster, who's also the head of athletics South Africa track and field. And we have a very good relationship. And when he heard about the project, he was so interested. So we also have been monitoring air pollution and environmental condition at all the national elite level athletics events in the last couple of years since the publication of that paper, which is also a very interesting data set. With that, we released a survey, and this was for elite track and field athletes, really trying to understand the respiratory effects that runners are facing. So we have the objective data. We measure in field where they're competing. It's not a station that's far away. We have the survey data, which we hope that we can get some interesting information. And that has been ongoing. And we hope to get a couple of publications out of that, with one that's submitted with corrections that we're busy with at the moment.
That sounds all exciting. I'm looking forward to reading them as a runner and a scientist. So I'm just going to try and circle back to now this paper, the findings, from when you started doing the research or the measurements or the monitoring, and then circling back because I think this study found that during the 22 comrades, I think 2022 comrades, runners were exposed to moderate heat stress conditions. Am I correct?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So then it alludes to what you said earlier, or it links up with what you've alluded to earlier, where you said you probably overestimated because you predicted that there might be strong or very strong heat stress conditions, but in actual fact, there are moderate heat stress conditions.
But that's the weather variability that comes into play. But once again, the moderate, low risk, moderate risk, high risk, this is all relative to the individual as well. I think in this case, we use the WBGT. It just, some people might experience heat stress symptoms at very low temperature. But yeah, it was moderate risk. There was some nice sea breezes as they ran into Durban. Luckily for the runners, but it could as well been very warm.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a long way back, but I couldn't remember particularly it being like too hot or anything. But I mean, it's such a tough day. You never know. It's hard to pinpoint what you felt and what caused the feelings and stuff.
It's also the accumulated time in the heat. So we may highlight there that you could have been exposed to moderate risk for 7 hours So we don't really know what the impact is of acute exposure. So acute exposure could be, you're just in there for less than an hour versus being in a moderate environment for 7 hours. There's that complexities that I don't really understand, and that maybe requires someone in the future to get some willing participants to stand in a laboratory setting on a treadmill and for 7 hours just run and see when they pass out, or what's the effect at the end of that 7 hours.
Yes, I'm sure that would make for a very good lab based, very controlled study, and then adapt from there, adjust from there, and use all kinds of other measures. But yeah, it's hard with these things. And I think maybe as we conclude, Caitlin will also ask one last question. But I think for me, the main takeaways would be know the general environmental conditions. If there's any information on that, try and prepare the best way possible or accordingly. And just remember that there are all these variables that need to be taken into consideration. Environmental conditions, like, is there a heat wave at the moment? Is there going to be a heat wave? What is the probability of a heat wave or rain, etc. And just remember those things as race organizers and as runners.
If I can highlight also, I just want to mention someone else's name. So when we started the measurements at the Comrades, a person that really provided a lot of insight, and that's also really been a great mentor, was Dr. Jeremy, in fear of butchering his name, Boutler. And Jeremy is the race day doctor, and he has been for the last couple of decades. And he just welcomed the research with open arms. He's like, this is so fascinating and so interesting. And immediately after the race, he called me and he discussed the temperatures and what they were seeing in the medical tent. And the Comrades Race Organization, working with them, working with the main medical doctor there, has just been wonderful. It's really, they've welcomed us with open arms, and I can just be very thankful.
So the last thing we want to ask, just to round off the podcast today, is do you have a last bit of advice or a comment for organizers or for runners on future directions in terms of your findings?
So, I think you can think of it in two ways. Maybe if we touch back on the first paper, it's to understand what history tells you about when and where the event is. What can you learn from that? And also, that I think I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, is that practice-based evidence. Your runners, your local population, they have a really good idea of what works, what doesn't work. So if from a race organized perspective, you organize something and you get a lot of comments, maybe think about those. As a race organizer, if you haven't run that race, maybe you don't know exactly what's going on. And if you get a broad consensus public view that this is going to be a problem, then the public's probably right. The public's very smart. And then, you use these interesting data sources, get in touch with a climatologist to do a little analysis for you. It could be interesting, and you could just make the probability of a high risk event occurring a bit lower. You can never stop it, but at least that knowledge is power. And then from a runner's perspective, it's also, once again, be aware of your environment and how you can adapt to it. If heat might be a concern, go read up on heat adaptation. I'll just say that I think South Africans were very tough. Heat adaptation isn't run in the middle of the day and dehydrate. It's slowly exposing yourself to warmer conditions with the right hydration strategy, and your body will adapt to those conditions and make it more resilient in moments where there's warmer than average conditions.
All right, that wraps up our episode for today. I just want to thank you so much, Henno, for coming onto the podcast, sharing your thoughts, giving us the run through on your studies and the commentary and what they entailed, and the importance of that. I'm a runner, I'm a scientist, so I found it very fascinating. If Caitlin wasn't keeping me in check, I would have still continued for another hour probably. So yeah, thanks for that and your time. And Caitlin will conclude just now, but from my side, I just want to thank you, and I'm looking forward to reading your future papers.
Thank you. Sorry for rambling on and on.
We love a good ramble. We love having guests on the pod who are passionate about what they do and have done. So the more rambling we get, the more happy we are. We don't consider it rambling. We consider it passionate insight. So if anyone has got a question for Henno, You are welcome to use our usual platforms, social media, the website to pose your questions. We'll make sure we get those questions to Henno. We'll have them answered for you. And then on a later episode, we're going to address all the questions that have been asked on our previous episodes. If you do want to find out what Henno is up to, we'll make sure his LinkedIn profile is linked onto our show notes. And then anyone who does want to go and check out what he's doing and where he is, you guys are more than welcome to do that. So just from our side, thank you so much for sacrificing your time and spending it with us, discussing your passion. We really do appreciate it, and we know that our listeners appreciate it too.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was nice to reflect back on the papers.
And if anyone else wants to chime in and do their next paper following up on Henno's papers, please do reach out to us. We would love to see what your results are. And if you do need any advice or any guidance on how you want to go forward, please be curious. Let's get some further research on this topic.